For over a century, a question has divided historians, humiliated empires, and sparked arguments that still rage online today. Did Chinese civilization rise on its own, or did it arrive from somewhere else? Western scholars once claimed the answer was West Asia. Chinese archaeologists insisted otherwise, but neither side had the one thing that could actually settle it, until scientists dug up bones bearing DNA older than the pyramids and ran the test. Because inside every human cell, there is a kind of time capsule, a molecule that has been quietly copying itself and passing itself forward for tens of thousands of years, generation after generation, largely untouched by politics, by propaganda, or by which side of a historical argument happened to be shouting the loudest at any given moment. Bones can be reburied, artifacts can be reinterpreted, inscriptions can be translated in ways that conveniently support whichever theory a scholar already believed before they started reading. DNA does not care about any of that. It simply records who was actually related to whom, who actually descended from whom, and where those ancestors actually came from, written in a code that only became readable in the last few decades, once the technology finally caught up to the question. To understand why this argument ever existed in the first place, you have to go back more than 100 years, to a time when European and American scholars were traveling through China, cataloging its artifacts, and trying to fit its history into a framework they already believed in. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a number of Western missionaries and early sinologists became convinced that Chinese civilization could not have emerged on its own. They looked at the bronze casting techniques appearing in the Yellow River Valley. They looked at the earliest Chinese writing systems, with their strange angular symbols carved into turtle shells and ox bones. They looked at the cosmological ideas embedded in early Chinese thought, the concepts of heaven, order, and cyclical time. And they concluded that all of it must have traveled east, carried by migrants or traders from the ancient civilizations of West Asia and the Near East, the so-called cradles of civilization that had already given the world writing, agriculture, and cities centuries earlier. It was a tidy theory. It fit the assumptions of the era, assumptions built on the idea that complex civilization only ever radiated outward from a small number of original centers, and that everyone else on the planet was simply a recipient of ideas invented elsewhere. For decades, this framework shaped how Western textbooks described the rise of China. Some scholars pointed to similarities between early Chinese pottery designs and patterns found in Central Asia. Others noted resemblances in early metallurgy and argued that bronze working technology must have diffused eastward along ancient trade routes, arriving in China only after it had already been mastered somewhere else. Naturally, this did not sit well with Chinese scholars, and it did not sit well with the broader public once these ideas filtered into political and cultural conversations. To many in China, the suggestion that their civilization was a copy of someone else's achievement felt less like objective history and more like an extension of the same colonial mindset that had shaped so much of the world's relationship with China during the 19th century. Archaeologists in China spent much of the 20th century pushing back, uncovering site after site that showed continuous local development stretching back thousands of years, long before any meaningful contact with West Asia could have occurred. They pointed to independent farming traditions, independent pottery traditions, and eventually independent writing systems that showed no clear signs of foreign borrowing. The debate never fully went away. It simply moved. Instead of arguing over pottery shards and bronze alloys, both sides eventually found themselves standing in front of a much older and much more stubborn kind of evidence: bones. And decades later, science found a way to make those bones speak. The tool that finally settled the argument wasn't a new artifact or a newly translated inscription. It was ancient DNA. For most of the 20th century, archaeology could only tell you what people made, built, and left behind. It could not tell you who those people actually were, where their ancestors came from, or whether the people using a certain style of pottery were the descendants of the people who invented it, or simply neighbors who had adopted a new fashion. Genetics changed that completely. By extracting and sequencing DNA preserved inside ancient bones and teeth, often thousands of years old, researchers could finally trace direct biological lineages across time, independent of what tools, pots, or symbols a particular group of people happened to be using. Extracting that kind of information is not simple. Ancient DNA degrades over time, breaking down into short, damaged fragments that are far more difficult to work with than the clean, intact DNA scientists get from a living person's blood or saliva sample. Researchers typically have to drill into the densest, most protected parts of a skeleton, often a specific bone deep inside the inner ear known as the petrous bone, precisely because that dense structure tends to preserve genetic material far longer than other parts of the skeleton. From there, painstaking laboratory work in specialized clean rooms designed to prevent modern DNA from contaminating ancient samples allows researchers to piece together enough fragments to reconstruct a usable genome, sometimes from remains that are many thousands of years old. It is slow, expensive, and exacting work, requiring years of training and access to equipment. Most laboratories on Earth simply do not have, but it is also the only method available that can answer questions. No pottery shard, no bronze artifact, and no ancient inscription ever could. This is exactly the approach a team of researchers from Peking University took when they set out to answer, once and for all, how the people of ancient China were actually connected to one another and to the rest of the world. Led by two professors working out of the university's Biomedical Pioneering Innovation Center, the team focused their attention on a site called Baligang, located along the region that connects the Yellow River and Yangtze River cultural spheres, the two great river systems that gave rise to Chinese civilization as we know it. Working alongside researchers from Yunnan University and Minzu University of China, the team sequenced complete genomes from 58 ancient individuals whose remains spanned an enormous stretch of time, from the Middle Neolithic period all the way through to the Late Bronze Age. In human terms, that is a chain of ancestors and descendants stretching across several thousand years, all buried in roughly the same region, all now finally readable at the genetic level. What the DNA revealed first was almost immediately surprising. Even in the earliest Neolithic layers, long before anything resembling a unified Chinese state existed, the people living in this region already carried a blended ancestry, a genetic mixture combining what researchers now describe as Northern East Asian ancestry and Southern East Asian ancestry. In other words, the foundational population of early China was never a single, isolated group quietly developing in complete separation from its neighbors. From the very beginning, at least in this region, it was already a mixture, a convergence of lineages that had been moving, meeting, and blending for a very long time before anyone ever fired a piece of pottery or planted the first row of millet. Then came the finding that truly upended the old assumptions. As the researchers tracked how this ancestry mixture shifted over the following millennia, they expected to see it track alongside the archaeological record, meaning that whenever pottery styles changed, or farming techniques evolved, or new cultural fashions appeared, the underlying population should shift too, presumably because new groups of people were arriving and replacing or absorbing the old ones. But that is not what the genetics showed. Instead, the proportions of northern and southern ancestry sometimes remained remarkably stable, even while the archaeological culture around them was transforming. During certain well-documented cultural periods, including the Kujiling and Longshan phases, the genetic makeup of the population barely changed, even as the pottery styles, tools, and settlement patterns evolved dramatically. This single observation quietly demolished one of the oldest assumptions in the origin debate. For 100 years, the argument on both sides had largely assumed the same underlying logic, that cultural change equals population change, that a new style of pottery or a new farming method must mean new people showed up carrying it with them. The genetic evidence from Baligang suggests something far more interesting. Ideas, technologies, and cultural practices could spread across ancient China the same way they spread almost everywhere else in human history, through contact, exchange, and imitation, without requiring a wave of migrants to physically replace the people already living there. The population stayed largely the same. The culture evolved around them. This is, in effect, an indigenous story of innovation, not a story of foreign populations sweeping in and rewriting the genetic map every time the pottery changed style. But the Baligang discoveries were not the only shock this research delivered. Buried within one of the archaeological layers at the site was a mass burial known as M13, containing the remains of more than 90 individuals. When the research team sequenced the DNA of 75 of those individuals, they found something that stopped them in their tracks. Every single one of the men buried in that collective grave carried the exact same Y chromosome lineage, the genetic marker passed down, unbroken from father to son. Meanwhile, the women buried alongside them showed a wide range of different maternal lineages, tracing back to many different family lines. In plain terms, the men in this burial were, biologically speaking, one continuous paternal bloodline, generation after generation, while the women had married in from many different backgrounds and communities. This is direct, unmistakable genetic proof of something historians had long suspected about early Chinese society, but had never been able to confirm at this level of certainty. A patrilineal clan structure in which descent, identity, and likely property or status passed down strictly through the male line, while women moved between communities through marriage, bringing in fresh genetic diversity from the outside. It is a glimpse into the actual social architecture of a community that lived roughly 4,000 years ago, reconstructed not from a legend or an inscription, but from the biological code still locked inside their bones. Think about what that actually means on a human level. Somewhere in this community, sons buried their fathers, and those sons went on to have sons of their own, who were eventually buried in the very same collective grave. generation folding into generation, all sharing one unbroken thread of paternal descent running through the center of the group like a spine. The women tell a completely different story, arriving from outside families, outside villages, possibly outside the immediate cultural sphere entirely, weaving new genetic material into the community with every marriage. It is, in a very real sense, a 4,000-year-old family tree, dug out of the ground and read back to us, not through any written record, but through chemistry. Zoom out from this single burial, and a much larger picture starts to take shape, one that finally answers the oldest part of the original debate. Where did the ingredients of Chinese civilization actually come from? The traditional story, confirmed and refined by this new genetic evidence, centers on two great rivers. In the north, the Yellow River Valley became home to communities who independently domesticated millet, developing a farming tradition that would eventually anchor the northern half of Chinese civilization. In the south, communities along the Yangtze River independently domesticated rice, creating an entirely separate agricultural tradition that would come to define the southern half of the same civilization. Both of these agricultural revolutions happened roughly 10,000 years ago, and crucially, both happened locally. Unlike the story of agriculture in parts of the ancient Near East and Europe, where farming technology often spread through the movement of populations who had domesticated crops elsewhere, the agricultural foundations of Chinese civilization were homegrown, invented on the spot by the people who were already living there. This detail alone quietly answers the old Western sinologist theory from a century ago. If early Chinese metallurgy, writing, and cosmology had truly been imported wholesale from West Asia, you would expect to see genetic evidence of a significant incoming population, a wave of ancestry connected to the Near East arriving in the Yellow River Basin around the time these technologies appear. The DNA shows nothing of the sort. Instead, it shows continuous, local ancestry stretching back through the same river basins for thousands of years, with agricultural and technological innovation emerging from populations that had been rooted in that specific landscape since long before any of these inventions appeared. Whatever inspired the sophistication of early Chinese civilization, it was not a foreign population replacing the people who already lived there. The Southern ancestry story carries its own remarkable twist, one that flips the old assumptions about influence entirely on their head. Researchers studying ancient remains along the southern Chinese coast, including a roughly 8,400-year-old skeleton recovered from Qihei Cave in Fujian province, found that this southern lineage is not just a footnote in Chinese history. It is the deep genetic root of the Austronesian-speaking peoples, the same broad family of populations whose descendants would eventually spread across Taiwan, the islands of the Taiwan Strait, and ultimately much of maritime Southeast Asia and the Pacific. In other words, rather than Chinese civilization being a downstream recipient of outside influence, the genetic evidence points to southern China as an origin point, a place from which population movements radiated outward, seeding ancestry across an enormous swath of island and coastal cultures far beyond its own borders. As the genetic map of ancient China continued to fill in, researchers also turned their attention to how these early northern and southern populations eventually gave rise to the group that would become the largest ethnic population on the planet, the Han Chinese. One especially telling study focused on an ancient population known as the Dai Qiang, who lived in the Ganking region, a landscape bordering the Central Plain area traditionally regarded as the heartland of early Han Chinese identity. For years, some historians had proposed that there must have been meaningful genetic exchange between the Dai Qiang and the ancestors of the Han Chinese, but no one had been able to prove it. Researchers sequenced remains from a Dai Qiang burial site, roughly 4,000 years old, and compared the genetic profile against other ancient populations across China, including a site associated with early Han ancestry from roughly 3,000 years ago, as well as thousands of modern Chinese genetic samples spanning dozens of regional groups. The results confirmed the old theory in striking detail. Statistical modeling showed that somewhere between roughly 13 and 18% of the ancestry found in northern Han populations from this period can be traced back to admixture with the Dai Qiang and genetic exchange that appears to have occurred somewhere between 3,300 and 3,800 years ago. Even more strikingly, when researchers examined the deep paternal and maternal lineages carried by the ancient Dai Qiang population, they found that a substantial portion of those same lineages, up to roughly a third of the paternal lines, and as much as 70% of the maternal lines, are still detectable inside present-day northern Han Chinese populations today. That means a huge percentage of the ancient genetic material carried by a single regional group 4,000 years ago is still quietly circulating inside the DNA of hundreds of millions of people living in China right now. This is the real story hiding underneath the old civilizational debate. Chinese ancestry was never a single pure lineage handed down unchanged from some singular founding population, the way old nationalist and colonial narratives alike sometimes like to imagine it. It was a layered, evolving genetic tapestry built from repeated waves of local admixture, intermarriage, and blending between distinct regional groups, stretching across thousands of years, long before anyone had a word for what a nation even was. There is something worth sitting with here, especially if you have ever taken one of the popular consumer DNA tests that promise to break down your ancestry into a neat pie chart of percentages and regions. Those tests are working with modern comparison populations, and they are useful for a lot of things, but they simply cannot see this deep. They cannot tell you that your Northern Han ancestry likely carries a meaningful thread of Daishang heritage from 4,000 years ago, absorbed through admixture long before anyone wrote the word Han down on a census or a family registry. They cannot tell you whether your paternal line traces back to a single clan buried together in a collective grave, bound by blood rather than by choice. Ancient DNA research like this is slowly filling in a layer of the human story that no amount of modern spit-in-a-tube testing could ever reach on its own, because it requires actual physical remains from actual ancient individuals, carefully excavated, carefully dated, and carefully sequenced, one site at a time. The genetic record from this era of Chinese history is not only a story of peaceful farmers and quiet river valleys. Some of the discoveries reveal a much darker side of ancient life. At the site of Shimao, a fortified settlement roughly 4,000 years old in what is now northern China, archaeologists uncovered an enormous collection of human skulls, the largest assemblage of its kind found anywhere in China prior to the later Shang dynasty period. Using genetic analysis on the remains, researchers were able to reconstruct detailed family relationships among the individuals whose skulls were recovered, tracing pedigrees across as many as 4 generations. The scale and nature of this discovery suggests a level of organized violence and ritual practice at Shimao that historians are still working to fully understand, a chilling counterpoint to the image of steady agricultural progress found elsewhere in the genetic record. Meanwhile, further north and west, other genetic studies have been reconstructing the world that existed just beyond China's traditional borders. The Xiongnu, the nomadic steppe empire that rose to power roughly 2,000 years ago and became one of the greatest rivals of imperial China, have themselves been revealed through ancient DNA to have possessed a surprisingly multi-ethnic population structure, a patchwork of different steppe lineages bound together under one political and military system, rather than a single unified ethnic bloc. This detail matters for the larger story because it shows that the entire region surrounding early China, not just China itself, was defined by constant movement, mixing, and cultural exchange between distinct populations, rather than the sealed, isolated boxes that older historical narratives sometimes imagined. Empires on the steppe rose and fell through alliance and conquest as much as through bloodline, absorbing defeated groups rather than erasing them, which means the genetic frontier between what we now call China and what we now call the steppe was never a hard line at all, but a wide, blurry zone of intermarriage and shifting loyalty that lasted for centuries. All of this brings the story back to the deepest layer of the original question, the one that stretches back far beyond pottery, farming, or even the earliest river valley civilizations. Long before any of these more recent chapters, there was an even older and more fundamental debate running quietly in the background of Chinese anthropology, centered on the discovery of Peking man in the 1920s, a collection of Homo erectus fossils found near Beijing that seemed, to some early researchers, to suggest that ancient human ancestors had been present in the region for an extraordinarily long time. This raised a genuinely old scientific question. Did modern humans in China evolve locally and continuously from these much older human relatives, essentially an independent evolutionary story unfolding entirely within East Asia? Or did modern Homo sapiens populations, who first evolved in Africa, eventually migrate into the region and become the true ancestors of everyone living there today, with Peking man representing a much older, unrelated branch of the human family tree that eventually went extinct, rather than continuing on into the present population? Genetic research has provided a remarkably clear answer to this question, one that researchers at institutions including Fudan University in Shanghai, home to leading population geneticists studying the deep migration history of East Asian populations, have helped confirm through large-scale genetic mapping projects. The overwhelming majority of genetic ancestry found in modern Chinese populations traces back to the same out-of-Africa migration that gave rise to every other modern human population on Earth, rather than representing an independent, locally evolved lineage descending directly from ancient Homo erectus populations like Peking man. In other words, the deepest layer of the human story in China connects, just like every other population on the planet, back to a shared African origin, arriving in East Asia through waves of migration that unfolded over tens of thousands of years, long before agriculture, long before writing, and long before anything resembling civilization as we understand it. So where does that leave the original question, the one that started a century of arguments between Western sinologists and Chinese scholars, the one that asked whether Chinese civilization rose on its own or arrived from somewhere else? The genetic evidence, gathered piece by piece across dozens of sites, thousands of samples, and multiple independent research teams, delivers a remarkably layered answer, one that manages to satisfy neither the old colonial theory nor a simplistic nationalist counter-narrative, and instead replaces both with something more precise and, honestly, more interesting. At the deepest level, every population in China, like every population everywhere else on Earth, descends from the same ancient African origin shared by all modern humans. There was never a separate, isolated East Asian branch of humanity, evolving in total seclusion from the rest of the species. But at the level that actually matters for the question of civilization, meaning agriculture, technology, social structure, and cultural innovation, the evidence tells an entirely different story. The farming systems that fed early Chinese communities were invented locally, independently, in 2 separate river valleys, without meaningful input from outside populations. The population base that built on those agricultural foundations remained remarkably continuous across thousands of years, even as pottery styles, tools, and cultural fashions transformed around them. The social structures uncovered inside sites like the Baligang mass burial reveal complex, homegrown clan systems that had nothing to do with foreign influence. And the genetic influence that did spread outward from China, particularly from its southern coastal populations, moved in the opposite direction than the old theories assumed, radiating out into Taiwan, the Pacific, and maritime Southeast Asia, rather than arriving as a gift from some distant cradle of civilization further west. In the end, the century-old argument between the Western sinologists who insisted Chinese civilization must have been imported, and the Chinese scholars who insisted it developed entirely on its own, both missed something that only genetics could reveal. Chinese civilization was never a copy of someone else's achievement, and it was never a sealed, isolated miracle either. It was something far more human than either side wanted to admit. A population rooted in one place for thousands of years, gradually building, borrowing, marrying, and inventing its way into one of the most enduring civilizations the world has ever known, all while remaining connected, at the deepest genetic level, to the same shared human story that every person on this planet ultimately belongs to. That is the real answer buried inside the bones, not a single dramatic match to one ancient civilization somewhere across the globe, but a slow, layered, deeply human process of continuity, exchange, and quiet transformation, written into the DNA of a people who never actually needed to borrow their identity from anyone else. And perhaps that is the more remarkable discovery after all, that the truth, once science finally had the tools to read it, turned out to be more complicated, more textured, and ultimately more compelling than either version of the myth that came before it. It is worth remembering that this story is still being written. Every year, more ancient burial sites are excavated across China, from the Loess plateaus of the north to the river deltas of the south. And every year, laboratories manage to extract slightly more genetic information out of slightly older, slightly more degraded remains than they could the year before. Sites that seemed completely genetically unreadable barely a decade ago are now quietly yielding full, usable genomes. Regions of the country that have barely been sampled at all are next in line, waiting for this next generation of researchers to reach them with better tools and cheaper sequencing methods. Which means the picture painted here, as detailed as it already is almost certainly incomplete. Somewhere out there, buried under a farmer's field, beneath a modern highway, or beneath an entire modern city, there's very likely another Baligang, another Shimao, another quiet mass grave holding a story about kinship, migration, or violence that nobody has read yet, simply because nobody has dug there and nobody has asked the right question yet. What makes this particular scientific journey so compelling is not that it delivered a simple, satisfying answer to a century-old argument, the kind of clean, dramatic reveal that a headline promises but rarely delivers. It delivered something better, a far more accurate, far more human picture of how a civilization actually comes into being, not through a single migration, a single invention, or a single moment of arrival, but through thousands of years of people staying rooted in the land they were born on, occasionally welcoming outsiders in, occasionally sending their own children out into the world, slowly building something enduring out of nothing more than time, soil, and each other. So the next time you hear someone claim that an entire people's origin can be traced back to one single ancient match, one dramatic DNA reveal that supposedly changes everything overnight, remember what the actual evidence, gathered site by site, genome by genome, over more than a decade of patient research, actually shows. It is rarely that simple. It is almost always more interesting. And it is written quietly and patiently into the bones of the people who were there all along, waiting for someone to finally learn how to listen.